Reflection with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
And I guess when the colonists come over, again, when the original colonies were often had sort of a theocratic character to them, that the religion would be very important and built in. I think Massachusetts maybe would be a prime example of all of that.
Today in Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Reverend Robert Kirkland, Associate Pastor of St. Clement's Roman Catholic Church and Adjunct Professor of Law at the University of Toledo. Father Bacik and Father Kirkland will discuss the United States Constitution, the question of religion. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Bob, I love to talk to you about political matters and the relationship of human beings to society, and I want to talk a little bit about the question of the Constitution, and especially slanted in the direction of the questions around religion. I know that that's a field that you love to talk about. Actually, I could now give you 27 minutes to give a mini lecture on this topic, but the program's supposed to be a dialogue, so I better say something in the beginning here just to make sure I get my side of this in here. We're talking the Constitution, of course, as you have pointed out to me in the past, in its original form in Article 6, made one small statement about religion. It said, what is this? That no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office of public trust under the United States. So that's the only real mention of religion in the original 7 articles that constituted the Constitution. Then, of course, it was taken up again in the First Amendment of the Constitution, the famous one about the establishment of religion and the freedom of religion. So, anyway, we might begin talking a little bit along that line.
Well, it's interesting. As a matter of fact, even James Madison, who was as much the father of the Bill of Rights, insisting that a Bill of Rights had to be proposed to the states, as he was father of the Constitution, it opposed, so far as we know, throughout, the idea that there should be a Bill of Rights, or even that it would be wise to have one. He and those who thought as he did, including most of the people, the framers of the Constitution, felt that the danger lay in the supposition that if a right was not among those enumerated, it didn't exist, it wasn't there. And they said that isn't what the Constitution does, because you don't need a Bill of Rights, since the Constitution says what the limits of the federal government are going to be, and since that is limited, if there is not a right extended to the federal government in the body of the Constitution, then that the individual or the individual state is left free. And so that particularly when there was call in 3 states, and especially for some kind of statement of freedom from coercion in the matter of religion, that Madison and those who agreed with him argued that the no religious test clause of the 6th article of the Constitution, which you have just read, was an adequate defense, since it meant that government could not identify any religion, nor could it bring religion into the sphere of public administration and the formulation of public policy. And
so their thought was that this would take care of the matter. It'd probably be good, Bob, for us to get a little picture of the history of this period and you know the functioning of religion. I mean, if you go through the longer history, we could see at the beginning, like in the New Testament period, the Christians sort of moved out of the sphere of political life. They lived a more ghettoized kind of existence, I guess you would say. They weren't terribly interested in changing the political structures because they didn't have much sense of the long history of human endeavors and thought the Lord was coming back again soon and so on, so they weren't all that interested in it. And then we got into a period in the 4th century where the church really got more involved in the political life because it was set up as sort of the glue for the empire by Constantine and Theodosius, and so religion Christianity became important to holding it together, the linchpin in a sense, and part of the glue. And then we got a whole long period of involvement and so on, and we ended up with established religions in Europe and so on. And so we have a sort of background history to this. And then I guess when the colonists come over, again, when the original colonies were often had sort of a theocratic character to them, that the religion would be very important and built in. I think Massachusetts maybe would be a prime example of all of that. So maybe you could comment on that a little bit and help set the stage here for understanding the directions they wanted to go in religiously.
Well, there were a number of, that long history that you refer to had a number of significant developments, even though at first glance it looks as though it's an unbroken continuity of development. One of the things is the church and state in the medieval picture were separate institutions, and there was no question that they were indeed separate and distinct. The question, however, was how they were to relate to one another, who was boss, because they had not really focused on the individual person as God's image and likeness, but rather they focused on the institution of the church and the state. But then what happens, in consequence of the Reformation, the principle cuius regio eis legio, who owns the kingdom, it's his religion that is the effective
the religion. Yeah.
That's right. And so that you get that, the Germans have that marvelous word for it, the Eigenkirche, which is to say that the ruler had his own church, and that was the church of his kingdom and his
and
people,
all of his subjects, yeah.
and of all of his subjects. And so what happened was that the idea of the distinctness of two institutions, church and state, is dissolved because the church, in one form or another, becomes an instrument of government and of governmental policy. I think one of the tragedies of the Reformation is that the sincere and profoundly sincere religious aspirations that were caught up on the part of so many people in the Reformation were, in the second generation of the Reform, put to political purposes by astute politicians who were very, very shrewd and utterly unscrupulous in their pursuit of it. At the same time, when the American colonies began to be established, there's not much question that most people were rather explicitly religious. They might not have had church affiliation except in the measure it was necessary, but all of the colonies, I think without exception, included among the purposes for which they were chartered the idea of bringing the gospel to the natives. And there was a very distinct religious form. Well, when they came to the colonies, they brought with them the idea of the establishment. They may have been escaping an establishment that was contrary to their own religious position in the old country, but the idea that there should be an establishment was part and parcel of their cultural baggage.
Right, and we have to remember that when we were trying to put this Constitution in some sort of framework.
Oh, yes.
There was always a question of religious liberty, because if in this colony this particular religion was the dominant one, then the minority had to figure out what to do. And one of the things they would often do is move.
That's right.
And get out of there. It gives us a lot of our own sense of freedom here in the United States. Is in sense geographical. That is, there's always a sense that if you were felt constrained within a given place, this colony, then you moved onward, moved westward usually, and found some new place where you would have that freedom.
Well, yeah, except the problem with that is that with only a couple of exceptions, the evil of establishment was demonstrated by people who had no place to move. The separatist Baptists, who were a peculiar, originally small category of Calvinists, identified with the Baptists, after a while realized that theologically they had grown into an identification with them. The great exponent in Massachusetts, very articulate man, was Backus, Isaac Backus, who was one of the first trustees of Brown University, by the way. And from his point of view, there wasn't any place for them to go. Rhode Island, yes, allowed them freedom. Pennsylvania, yes, allowed them freedom. But apart from that, they had no place to go. And in those days, it was illegal after the proclamation of 1763 to go over the watershed of the Allegheny Mountains, so that they were pretty well contained. And therefore, they insisted that in the colonies where, in fact, they lived, typically New England. Later, some of them migrated to Virginia, where they found themselves unwelcome, and thence into Maryland, where they came to a substantial share of power eventually. But they were the people who raised the issue. Most of the American colonists were, except for the Anglicans, were Calvinists of one sort or another. And while they shared certain common assumptions, and they had very little use for Catholics or Jews or what they called atheists, and I'm not sure exactly what they meant. They nonetheless had a great deal of quarrel among themselves, and they all distrusted the Anglicans because the Anglican establishment was part of the British government. They were British colonies, and the Anglicans wanted to have an American bishop. And they wanted to have a bishop so that their youngsters could be confirmed, and they wouldn't have to send them on a perilous trip across the ocean in flimsy little wooden ships to seek ordination. And
when you think of the great universities, Harvard and Yale and so on, had these divinity schools immediately and were thought of as institutions that would prepare the clergy.
Oh, yes, indeed
and to serve the needs of the people. I mean, that's something that still continues. We have these fine divinity schools at these originating universities.
I've often wondered how long it's been, because I think it has disappeared, but I've often wondered how long the words pro Christo et ecclesiae disappeared from the seal of Harvard College. They were there for a long time.
Yes, it's good to remember those denominational origins of those places.
Yes.
And also, I mean, many of our colleges in the state of Ohio now, we have denominational beginnings and still have some sort of ties, although they've loosened over the years.
Yeah.
Loosened over the years.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I had a student who wrote a master's thesis just this past spring on the establishment of colleges in Ohio before the Morrill Act, the Land Grant Act, which provided federal funds for arts and technical colleges. And the experience was that actually religion was played a critical role in the establishment of every institution of higher education in Ohio before the Morrill Act in 1862.
Bob, when you're talking about that situation in the early times, we might point out the situation of Catholics at that time. I think that around the time of the Constitution, there were about 35,000 Catholics in the United States out of a population of 4 million. And they were not in all that good a position.
That's right.
For a long period of time. I think they weren't thought of as being equal citizens in any way, and had certain rights denied them and so on.
That depends on where they were. The Carroll family, of course, in Maryland had long been powerful and wealthy because of it represented Maryland's earliest tradition of a haven for Catholics under the early Lord Baltimore, the Calverts. But
so one of the reasons we would end up with the original diocese being Baltimore,
yes,
where the
so.
first Bishop Carroll would have been.
But for the rest of it, Catholics were not particularly welcome, even where they were not overtly persecuted. But they were felt to be a threat, really, to the kinds of freedoms and the kinds of ideals that Americans were seeking, because Catholics particularly were so identified with a church that had always insisted on its superior control of the governmental policy and administration.
So that, again, that sense of freedom came into that whole outlook. Of course, that is not a situation that just was confined to the early years. We have the long-standing nativist prejudice. I think it was Arthur Schlesinger who said it was the most enduring prejudice in the United States, which was a prejudice against Catholics. And, of course, we saw that in the period of the great immigration in the 19th century to these shores, of the immigrants often being painted as the people who drank too much and had too many children and who were dirty and were not the hard-working, waspish types that they wanted here in this country. So that is really a long-standing sort of prejudice, and we saw it at work in the time of the Constitution.
Well, of course, yeah, and it was enhanced in the 19th century by the fact that many of the Catholic immigrants were not natively English-speaking. The Irish were, but the Italians, the Poles, the Germans.
That's right. They had to adjust with the language as well.
And so that they became the victims of other prejudices that were compounded.
Now, Bob, we're trying to get at here the genius of the Constitution around the question of religion, but I mean, we were trying to set the stage and give a little bit of feel for the situation. And now, I wonder, does it help to get at this by talking a little bit about the people who framed the Constitution and their religious understanding? I think one thing is that always strikes me about these people is that they were great. I mean, at one period in history, they have all of these great people, Washington and Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton, assembled together, and Benjamin Franklin, not to forget him. And even on the religious side, you had somebody in the Catholic community, John Carroll by name, who seemed to be an extremely astute person and very much in tune, interestingly enough, with the whole thinking process about the separation of church and state that we find in the Constitution and so on. And
actually not John, but his cousin Charles. Carroll.
Okay, go ahead.
He was one of the people who called for some kind of protection specifically against.
Well, I know, but I was talking about John Carroll, the one who ended up as being.
Oh, I was thinking you were thinking of Charles Carroll.
No, I meant John Carroll and adopting that sort of attitude.
Yeah, of course, it was already made for him by the thinking of people like Charles Carroll.
Okay, go ahead.
When you're talking about political leadership and the people who framed the Constitution and the people of that generation, I think that I don't think that it helps an awful lot to look at the religious background of the framers. They varied a good deal. Some of them certainly were deistic in inclination, although the Enlightenment didn't have the same kind of influence in this country as may have shown in that fine book on the Enlightenment in America that it had on thinking in Europe. But
they were less anti-clerical, for one.
That depends on where you come from. I think there's not much question that the people in Virginia, for example, Madison and Jefferson, were distinctly anti-clerical, and that's because, among other things, the Anglican clergy tended to be at best lukewarm supporters of the Revolution. Many of them were Tories, many of the more prominent ones, and therefore, unlike the Calvinist clergy in New England, the Congregationalists and clergy in New England, and the Presbyterians in New York, who supported the Revolution, they became the rather unliked persons, and so that certainly entered into it. But there were devout persons, devout Congregationalists and Presbyterians, and so on, as well as Episcopalians in the people who put together the government we live under.
They seemed willing to talk about religion. I mean, there's a famous quote from Benjamin Franklin about the tough times, I think in July of 1787 when they were debating the Constitution.
And everybody was embarrassed by what he said, though. It dropped.
He came out, but, made all these comments about putting this in the hands of the Almighty, and God is directing our activities and so on. Right, yeah.
And it dropped like a chunk of lead. The feeling you get from reading the notes of the various people who refer to that, who were there, is that they were all kind of embarrassed by it.
Do you think that's because Madison slanted the notes?
No, because it's true in other comments on the proposition as well, by people who were there. No, I think what they felt was, and I think this gets to the heart of the matter in a way, but Jim, and I think that the point was that the political arena, the political sphere, was a secular sphere, and that it was not their business to be talking about religion, and even to try to talk about something like Franklin's proposal of opening each day's session with prayer was going to lead them to say, well, whose prayer is it going to be, and who's going to do it, and this kind of thing, and this is not why we've gathered, and it's not within the scope of our commission that has brought us here. Because when we talk about the Constitution as a limitation of power by law, one of the objects of the freedom that limitation of governmental power considers or aims at is the freedom of the individual person in the quiet possession and enjoyment of his rights. And they very clearly had been compelled by the experience of religious controversy, a great deal of it in this country, in the colonies before the Revolution, to the realization that a man's religious liberty was a civil political right.
Now, how did they rise above the sort of maybe the common conception of the people who thought of the colonies as being sort of theocracies? I mean, that might be too strong a term, but there was that sort of establishment notion that while they wanted to rebel against that, they still had it in their bones, it seems. And you have the clergymen being very powerful persons and leaders in the community. Again, Massachusetts, I guess, comes to mind. But in a sense, the framers of the Constitution, do I want to say, rose above that or adopted a more secularist viewpoint in a way? Now, how do we account for this? Or
I think in arriving at a secularist viewpoint, they rose above the past. In other words, and this is the point that my friend John Courtney Murray made so clear, that there are two different spheres of life entirely. One is the individual person as a human being, as a human person, and the other is the person as a citizen, a public person, as a member of the political community, and that while in his own mind he has to put the lessons of the experience and the wisdom of those two spheres together to say where he comes down in practical terms, nonetheless the spheres themselves are distinct, and government exists only for the sake of those public concerns which do not include the religion of the individual person, since that's an intensely personal thing, and therefore a right, a civil right.
Maybe I could put the question this way: if you'd have gathered a different group of folks in 1787, and you could have gathered a group that would have been trying to maybe create a theocracy, people who didn't understand that distinction you're talking about. I think that's what I find remarkable.
Oh, there were people, I think, in the convention as it and certainly in the ratifying conventions, who did not share that insight of the framers. But
they were the dominant figures. It's probably just because they were such great people
and
and
the practical,
so strong.
Yeah, but there was also the practical political question that whose establishment was going to be. That there's a quaint gentleman in the South Carolina Ratifying Convention who observes that he supposes that if there is an establishment, it will be an Episcopalian one, but he, for his own sake, would just as soon there weren't any, even though he considers himself a devout Episcopalian.
Yeah. So you're saying it was a practical matter. You couldn't achieve unity unless you bypassed that question, or at least ruled the religious question out. And that these people, like Washington and Jefferson, who wasn't so involved, and Madison and Hamilton, understood that, and thus were able to frame a compromise document that could allow the formation of the United States.
Yeah, Luther Martin of Maryland, who was one of the kind of second or third rate figures, not certainly a man of inconsiderable talent, objected rather bitterly to the Constitution's not laying down some religious test, as for example that one ought to be a Christian or a Protestant Christian, and he felt that it was a bad thing to do. So that there were people who thought that way about it, and it's the wisdom of the people who saw that you had to separate these areas entirely and that limit government to secular purposes and goals that would work, and who were able to appeal to the political sense of the others to realize that this was the only way they were going to fly.
Good. Yeah, I understand that. That's helpful. Now, their sense was, at least some of them, that in the Constitution, with the one statement in Article 6 that you couldn't have a religious test to hold public office, would cover that. But as a matter of fact, they came to see they needed to say more, and that brings up the whole amending process, which again is one of the geniuses of the whole Constitution. They did understand that the people may well come to understand that they need to change things, make alterations, and therefore we could have this process of amendment, which has been a brilliant thing, of course, throughout all of our history, and has enabled us to keep pace with the times and to make adjustments and so on. And we call that first 10 amendments that occurred very early, 1791, the Bill of Rights, and talks about the rights. And in there, the First Amendment, of course, is where we find the religion clause, and the one that we continue to debate all throughout our history. You want to comment again on that amending process or that First Amendment?
Yeah, the genius of the amending process was, of course, the idea that for the first time it provided a regular constitutional mechanism for the revision of fundamental law. The Constitution is fundamental law. It expresses in a very basic way the people's understanding of the consensus that binds them together. And before that, before the definition of a regular constitutional mechanism for amending that basic consensus, the only thing you could do if you wanted to change the Constitution was have a revolution. It might be a non-violent, quiet revolution like the English Revolution, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, or it might be the sort of thing by which the French overthrew the past. But in any circumstances, it called for a revolution. So the amending power itself is
was that a really innovative idea? I mean, like some of the other ideas in the Constitution have forerunners, like the separation of powers and the three branches is found in Montesquieu and so on. Is there a precedent for this sort of amending power in political theorists?
In political theorists, people thought about it, and as a matter of fact, the fact that the British, for example, have no written constitution made it a little bit easier for them to do so, because there wasn't any charter that marked out in detail what the Constitution was. But this is the first time when you have a mechanism put in place in a working political system to do this. And of course, it has made just a tremendous difference. Now, when you get around to the Bill of Rights, the fascinating thing about it is that with very few exceptions, the framers of the Constitution did not believe in a Bill of Rights. They regarded it as being dangerous because they were afraid that if the right was not enumerated, it would not therefore be included in the protections afforded by the Constitution. And they felt furthermore that it was unnecessary since the Constitution was a limitation of government, and therefore if there was anything which government was not authorized by the document as they had drafted it to do, it lay outside the power of government.
It would be in the hands of the state or of the individuals at that point.
Madison was one of the people who very stoutly took that point. Madison makes it quite clear that he believes that the no religious test clause of the Sixth Amendment was quite adequate defense of religious liberty.
I have a different sense of, you and I have a different sense of Madison entirely. Yours is a well-founded one. Mine is impressionistic. But I see him in a much more positive light, and as being a well-educated and sort of a brilliant political tactician.
Oh, yeah.
And my sense is that there was at least somewhere along the line when he said no, we have to have these amendments.
Oh, yeah, he did.
I don't know if he changed his mind or what. But
there's no evidence, Jim, so far as I know, that he ever changed his mind, at least for that period of time, about the wisdom of having those 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights or not. What he did do was come to the recognition that for political considerations, you had to have the Bill of Rights incorporated in the Constitution by way of amendment, because remember, even today, the Constitution is a fixed fact of major importance, and anybody would come along and attack the Constitution in principle would be obviously considered a little bit out of his mind. But the Constitution was a very, very fragile compromise. It was striking a balance between a number of small individual entities, the various departments of government that had to work together if they were to work at all, and the small states and the large states that had to collaborate in this very delicately constructed balance if they were to work at all together for the common welfare. And so that Madison's point of view was that the Constitution itself was in peril if there were not a Bill of Rights.
Okay, I would love to say more. The First Amendment, of course, says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And I guess without going through a whole lot of long discussion about that, we live under that and we have prospered under that. And the Catholic community, which was persecuted and underwent the nativist prejudice, has really prospered under this sort of setup, as have all other religious groups, so that it's shown that freedom really is of the essence of religion, and that to have a free situation is a very healthy one. So in that sense, the Constitution, especially the First Amendment, have been really godsends. Our bishops once said that the framers wrote better than they knew, and I think that certainly is true.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Reverend Robert Kirchner, associate pastor of St. Clement's Roman Catholic Church and adjunct professor of law at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was the United States Constitution, the question of religion. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Minister, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.